There it goes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Reeves, and this is a panel discussion about the effects of post-traumatic slave syndrome, or PTSS, as we'll refer to it in this discussion. PTSS is a theory authorized by Dr. Joy DeGruy about the developed adaptive behaviors of African Americans in order to cope with the oppressive and systematic conditions of this time that have roots dating back to slavery. My mother and sister are here with me to give their perspectives on this topic. So let's begin. Okay, so in my research for doing my paper on PTSS, I learned about certain aspects, like the author Joy DeGruy was talking about. Slavery asserted that dehumanizing of African Americans allows systems to continue to perpetuate heinous acts against this community. So that made me think of systematic racism, the high rate of incarceration of African Americans, police brutality, the low-income cities and neighborhoods, lack of education and the better educational resources, and also some of the key features in this article that I printed out. It's called The Past Does Matter, a Nursing Perspective on Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. It talks about the different key aspects of PTSS. One is vacant esteem, or a state of believing oneself to have little or no worth, typically accompanied by depressive feelings, negative self-perception, and hopelessness, which I think is something I know that I relate to when we talk about the effects of slavery. Just watching certain documentaries about civil rights movement, lynching, Roots, 12 Years a Slave, all that kind of stuff. It's very depressing, and you do feel a certain hopelessness of like, how did they survive this? And then thinking about things that we go through and that we see now, and how do we end racism in America? That's a big, broad box to unpack. So, Nikki, you being an African American literature teacher, what are some of the things that you've seen, behaviors maybe in your students or in the books that you've read that you bring to the classroom that have to do with the connection between slavery and the oppression that was brought onto our people then and the oppression that we see now systematically, things that may be similar, different, the continuing struggle for ending racism and really finding our unity and our strength in who we are as a people.
Okay. Well, you asked a couple of questions, Micah, and the first one would be certain resources that I use in the classroom. Several years ago, an administrator and I read a book by a young lady by the name of Ruby Payne, and the book was titled, or the study was titled, AHA Process, or the AHA Process, and it was understanding poverty and how poverty affected our students as learners. And in this process, one of the things, and I actually went back into resources that I love that she talked about, was hidden rules. Rules that students from different, God bless you, rules that students from different socioeconomic statuses and how they function. For example, a student that lives in poverty functions a lot differently than a student who is in the middle class or is well-to-do. Some of the hidden rules, it asks you, would you be able to function, if you came from poverty? And I remember some of the questions asked things like, would you know a church to go to if you needed resources as far as food, clothing, and shelter? It also asked questions like, would you know how to contact a bail bondsman if you needed to bail somebody out of jail? One of the other questions that it asks that I think is very powerful is, do you know how to use, oh God, what was it called? God, gosh, a certain language in order to finagle if you're buying a car and how to bring the price of the car down. When you talk about middle class society or students living in that middle class socioeconomic status, there are things that I found that I could relate to there as well. Things like attending a church regularly, but attending a church maybe that's not in your neighborhood or not as close to your neighborhood, or one closer to your neighborhood. One of the other things that I noticed when I looked at poverty versus middle class is when I took the test, I was able to do 16 in poverty and 16 in middle class. But then when I went to the upper class, I was only able to do 4, or had only experienced 4. Not that I couldn't do it, but I had only experienced 4. And that really shows, in a sense, the disparity sometimes, where I remember coming from that state of poverty. So it was easier for me, or would be easier, to live without a cell phone and a car versus, you know, being in an upper class society where you have more cars than people who live in the house. And the reason I bring that up is because when, as educators, we realize that our students have very different experiences than we do, we can't always judge them based on what they produce in the classroom versus, let's say, what we see on paper versus a conversation that we have. So in this state, at this point of COVID-19, where we're working from home, as educators, we want our students to thrive. In our particular school district, we made sure every student had a laptop. Well, that's great. But when you give it to a student who comes from maybe an impoverished household, maybe they don't have internet. So now you're dealing with a whole other issue. When you're dealing with students in maybe a middle class or upper class society, I see you.
Okay, you may continue.
Okay, sorry about that. So I was just saying that, you know, you're understanding the differences with our students, that maybe they have a laptop now or a computer that you've provided for them, but they don't have internet connection. You know, I was discussing earlier about Ruby Payne and could you survive in the middle class? Another one of those questions was, do you have a laptop or a computer for everybody in the household? Does every bedroom have a TV, you know, a TV and a DVD player, as it were? You know, so some of those things I would say in middle class, we don't always see those as challenges until you realize that they're challenges. One of the books that was actually recommended to me by a pediatrician is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, and I like how he's writing this letter as a way to explain to his son some of the things that he went through as a father, and now he's giving this discussion, and he really and I don't want to go too much off topic, but he really kind of goes into how slavery and segregation and all of that really do affect society today. The way that we believe, the way that we live, the way that we function. Even in, you know, the current movie, The Hate U Give, that was so powerful, and we used it as a tool in the classroom. We took the kids to see the movie, but we made sure they read the book first. It actually was a summer reading book for everybody in the entire school. And even them reading that, seeing the movie helped to make that connection, that beginning scene where he's teaching his son, you know, when you get stopped by the police, to keep your hands visible at all times. And that's a conversation that we have with our children. As an African-American mom, some of the conversations I had with my daughters before my son was what to do when you get pulled over by the police, and never to run, look them straight in the eye, that kind of thing. Not realizing, as much as we don't want to say it, we're still perpetuating that generational stigma of maybe you're less than them, or you have to work twice as hard. You want to dress, you know, as nice as, if not better. So those are the things that I bring into the classroom. Yes, they're stereotypes to some degree, but it happens. You know, we still have to talk to our kids about those things, how to function. We still have to have books like Between the World and Me. We still have to have things like James Baldwin. We still have to bring those things to life, because if we don't, not only are we losing our culture, but we're losing the foundation for why we do the things we do and why we believe the things that we believe.